Hi everybody, welcome back and thank you for joining. Today we are doing something a little bit different and we will be making some breakfast burritos. Now don't be confused by the name. You can eat these for breakfast, lunch, or dinner. Seriously, I eat these all the time for dinner and for lunch. As a matter of fact, I'm making these to have for my lunch for today. And it's a relatively easy recipe, and this is actually a recipe that I was given in foods class when I was in grade 7, and I still use it to this day. So I really hope that you enjoy this video, and I hope that it's quite easy for you to follow along as well. So let's get started. So the first thing you're gonna do is you're gonna preheat your oven to 350 degrees. So go and do that now. The next thing I want you to do is wash your hands. So go and do that if you have not yet done that already. Now we are going to heat some margarine in a frying pan on the stove here. Now your recipe says 10 mils of margarine. I am just going to put in about a teaspoon. So I'm actually just gonna scoop into my margarine here, about that size. And I'm gonna put it in my pan there. Now, this recipe, there's a lot of room to kind of add ingredients and change things up as you wish, as you will find out as we continue the video. So I'm actually gonna turn my stove onto low so that my butter can melt, okay? So I'm gonna leave that on low and I'm gonna move on to my next step here. We are going to cut up 1/4 of a red pepper and 1/4 of a green pepper, okay? So different color peppers, it's not, you don't have to. If you want to use 2 red peppers, that's perfectly fine. If you want to use 2 green peppers, that's perfectly fine as well. So what I'm just gonna do here is I'm gonna show you how to cut a pepper. Hopefully you can kind of see what I'm doing here. But the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm going to cut off the bottom of my pepper. So I'm just gonna turn it around and I'm gonna cut the bottom. So I've cut the bottom off a little bit, just like that. Next, I'm going to cut off the top of my pepper. So I'm gonna turn it around and do that. Please be careful when you're using knives, of course. Okay, so I've cut off my top just like that. So now I'm left with the core and the outside. So being very, very careful, what you're gonna do is you're gonna run your knife on the inside of your pepper to remove the core. Again, please be really careful when doing this. So there's my core. I'm just gonna set that aside here. So now all you have left of your pepper is the outer edge, okay? So I'm gonna cut it, my edge, so that it's open like that. If you're left with some of these white pieces, you're going to want to very carefully just cut those off. Never cut towards you. Or try to avoid it if you can. And make sure all your seeds are removed from your pepper. So again, like I said, this recipe, there's room for error. So it says a 1/4 of my red pepper. So I'm gonna cut about that much, okay? So that's maybe a little over 1/4 of my pepper. So this is something that you can eyeball and you can kind of use your judgment. If you want more pepper, you can put more. If you want less, you can have less. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna cut my pepper into short strips and I'll show you in just a minute. I'm gonna go along my pepper and cut them into short strips. About maybe a centimeter in length here, in width, sorry. Okay, once you've done that, I'm gonna do 2 strips at a time and I'm actually just going to cut them into little cubes. You can kind of make them as big or as small as you want. As you can see here, I'm doing just little cubes like that. Now, hopefully you can see what I'm doing okay enough. My butter is getting nice and sizzly over there. Absolutely turn down your heat on your stove if you need to. I know it can be really hard to multitask and watch a couple things at once. Okay, so I've got my red pepper into little cubes here. And I'm actually just going to put these directly in my pan with the butter. And they're gonna start sizzling nicely. Gonna move it around a little bit so my butter moves around. It's really good if you can try and use a non-stick pan for this. It works really well, a non-stick pan. And you actually don't need a very big pan for this recipe. You can use something small like I have here. Next, I'm gonna do the exact same thing with my green pepper. I'm going to cut off the bottom. So there's my bottom. I'm gonna cut off the top. There's my top. Again, please pause the video at any time if I'm going too fast. I'm gonna run my knife around the core here. Being very careful. So there's my core. Get all your seeds out of there. And I'm going to gently remove the white parts that are still on my pepper. That's okay. And make sure all your seeds are out. And I'm gonna cut about that much of my pepper. Again, you can add a little extra, you can add not as much. This recipe has a lot of flexibility, which is what I like so much about it. And again, I'm going to cut my pepper into small strips. My peppers are sizzling really nicely on the pan here. I know it might be a little bit hard for you to see what's going on over there, but I'll try my best to show you as I go. And again, I'm just going to do a couple strips at a time. Cut my green peppers into little cubes, and I'm gonna throw them into the pan with my red peppers. I've got a little seed there. Gotta get that guy out of the way. Awesome. It's looking really good. So the use of red and green peppers, I think it's partially for color. It looks really nice having a couple different colors in there. But like I said, if you have 2 green peppers, feel free to use 2 green peppers. If you have yellow or orange, you can use those as well. It's perfectly fine for this recipe. All right. So I'm gonna throw my green pepper in there. Now again, really important for me personally, I'm just gonna flip my cutting board over and switch out my knife. For me personally, I really like peppers. So I added a little bit more than a quarter of my pepper. But that's because I personally really love peppers. So you can really add as much or as little of the peppers as you want. So they're nicely sizzling there. Now I turned up my heat just a little bit. So now I'm just a little bit past my low heat. And you can just stir your peppers once in a while, okay? While my peppers are sauteing in my pan there, I'm going to start cutting my onion. So for this recipe, you can actually use green onions, or you can use a regular onion, okay? So you can use either or, it doesn't really matter. They both work quite well. It's just personal preference. And for me, personal preference is green onions. So I'm gonna cut a little bit of green onions to add to my sauteing peppers. Now, according to your recipe, you need 1/4 of a knife or 1/4 of green onions of what I'm gonna be using. So if you're using a regular onion, what you're gonna do is you're going to peel your onion really well, make sure there's no skin on it, and then you're gonna cut it in half, turn it around, cut it in half again, and you're going to use one of those little slices that you cut. So after you cut, there should be 4 big slices of onion, and you would only use one of them, okay? Hopefully that makes sense. Again, you could add a little more if you'd like, a little less if you'd like, but for me, I'm gonna use about 3 green onions. Again, that's personal preference. Because I'm using green onion, I'm gonna cut off the bottom part because you only really want the green part. I don't really want this bottom part here, so I'm just gonna put it aside. And I'm just going to, a tiny, tiny bit, cut off the tops. You don't really need to, but I'm gonna do that. Okay, so I've got a few green onions here that I'm gonna chop up. I might not chop up all of this. I might only chop up a little bit, but as I said before, I'm gonna kind of go and see what I think once I've started adding in. My peppers are looking really good. They're getting nice and soft. So the reason we're sauteing the peppers is so that they can get a little bit soft, because you don't want them really hard in your burritos, but you don't want them really mushy either. I'm just lowering my heat a little bit. Okay. I'm gonna start chopping up my green onions here. And again, according to your recipe, it says 1/4 of an onion. So if you're using a regular onion, again, you'd cut it in half, turn it around, cut it in half again, and then you would use one of those quarters. Okay, I think that this is pretty good in terms of an amount that I'd like to put in my burritos, okay? So I'm going to add that to my peppers. Again, I did reduce my heat back down to low. Give it a little stir. So as I threw those onions in, I quite like the amount that I have. I'm just gonna put maybe one more cut in. And then I think for me personally, I like the amount that I've put in there. So I'm just gonna try and show you what I have in my pan. So I've got my green onions, my red peppers, and my green peppers. Green onions, green peppers, red peppers. It's looking really nice and colorful in there. I'm just gonna let that saute for a bit there. That looks really good. Okay, next we get to scramble some eggs. So this recipe calls for 2 eggs. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to crack my eggs into a bowl first. I always like to do that in case I get a shell in my eggs, and then I can just scoop it out with a spoon. So you're gonna crack 2 eggs into a small bowl. Good, I got no shells in there. I'm just gonna wash my hands. And for this step, you're gonna need a fork. So I've just grabbed a fork here. And what I'm gonna do is with my fork, I'm going to whisk my eggs. Like what I'm doing here. Whisk until they're nice and scrambled. Hopefully you can see that. Okay. Awesome. Again, I've reduced it to low heat just so it continues to saute there. Now here, I'm going to add my chili pepper and my garlic pepper. Oh, sorry, my garlic powder. My chili pepper and my garlic powder. So first I'm gonna do the chili powder. Don't be concerned about heat. It's actually really not that bad. And again, you can add a little more or a little less. For me personally, I am going to add, half a teaspoon, I think. I'm gonna add half a teaspoon of chili powder and garlic powder. If you want less, please feel free to put in less. I like a lot of flavor, so I'm gonna do half a teaspoon, and I'm going to put that in my bowl with my eggs there. So I just added chili powder. Next, I'm gonna add my garlic powder. Again, I'm going to do half a teaspoon for lots of flavor. Scrape off the top with my knife so I don't put in too much. Sprinkle that in there. And you can kind of judge how much you have once you whisk it together. Okay. So I quite like the amount that I've put in there. If it doesn't look like enough, add more. Again, this recipe is really good for personal preference. Now what I'm gonna do with this mixture, with my eggs here, I'm gonna actually pour it into my pan with my peppers and my green onions. And this part is going to go fast. All you're gonna do is take a spatula and run your spatula along the sides and around the pan until the eggs are fully cooked. And you're gonna constantly be stirring this. This process happens really fast, so it's good to keep stirring it and to keep your eyes on it. Good. It's basically like making scrambled eggs, if you've ever made scrambled eggs before. You're scrambling them nicely. So my pan is really loaded with peppers and green onions, remember that's personal preference. I love peppers. So if you added less, that's perfectly fine. It will still be really yummy. So as you can see here, my eggs are almost complete. Just until they're nice and done. And I think that looks almost perfect. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna turn my stove off since my eggs are cooked nicely. Now we're actually almost done. So what I'm gonna do now is I am going to add some salsa. Now I chose mild. That's just because I didn't want a lot of spice. So according to your recipe, it says 75 mils of salsa. Remember, what I love about this recipe is you can kind of adjust it as you go. 75 mils is approximately a quarter cup. Okay, so it's approximately a quarter cup. So I'm gonna add maybe a little bit less than that, and then add more if I feel like I need more. So I'm just gonna scoop my salsa in here. Okay, so I'm gonna start with that, a little bit less than a quarter cup, and you're actually gonna add it directly to the pan. And you're gonna mix it up. And you know what? I think that was a perfect amount. If you'd like to add a little more, that's perfectly fine as well. But for me, that was a perfect amount. Okay, now we get to roll the burritos. So I'm just gonna put aside some of my dishes. It's good to clean up as you go. Now, I'm gonna grab a cookie sheet. Okay, so rolling them is actually really simple, so don't be too concerned. So I here have some tortillas, and I'm using the small ones. So there's usually large ones and there's usually smaller ones. I've chosen to use small ones like this, and I've also chosen to use whole wheat. So I'm just gonna put my first tortilla on my pan here. I'm gonna grab a spoon, and I'm gonna spoon. I don't wanna overflow my burrito, but I do want a bit in here. Now you can roll it kind of however you would like to roll it. For me, I'm just gonna kind of fold it over and then over again. Nice and simple. This recipe, it doesn't make a lot. It makes maybe 3 burritos maximum. But I'm probably just gonna make maybe 2 big ones. Okay, now I love cheese, so I just have some shredded cheese here. And I'm actually going to add a little bit on top. And what this is gonna do is it's gonna actually melt really nicely in the oven. And to roll my burrito, I'm actually just using toothpicks that I can use to keep my burrito in place. So again, my rolling technique is super simple. I'm just going over one side and over again, nice and tight. And I'm going to add 2 toothpicks to keep it nice and rolled like that. Okay, I'm gonna do a second one. Okay, these look really nice. And yeah, like I said, these are actually my lunch for today. So you can eat them for breakfast, for dinner, or for lunch. I'm a huge fan of breakfast for dinner. And I'm sure a few of you watching are as well. So like I said, you can make 3 if you'd like, but I'm just making 2 large ones. And when I say large, I mean really full ones with lots of filling on the inside. Again, I'm just gonna take some shredded cheese. You can add as much cheese or as little cheese as you want. You don't even need to add cheese if you don't want to. Again, I'm going to roll one half, roll the other half, and put 2 toothpicks in the middle. Okay, we're almost done. I really love sprinkling a little bit of cheese on top. Before putting it in the oven, and then it's gonna melt really nicely on top. Okay. And we are ready to put them in the oven. Now, earlier I told you to preheat your oven to 350 degrees, so your oven should be nice and preheated by this time. Now, you're actually only going to put these in the oven until the cheese is melted, okay? That's really important. So I suggest keeping your eye on it constantly because it's gonna happen quite fast. It's probably not gonna be in there for more than a minute. You just want the cheese to melt. So as soon as it's melted, you're gonna take it right out of the oven. And that's about it. That's the recipe. And again, like I said, there's lots of room to change it if you want to add a little bit more of something, a little bit less of something. There's tons of ways that you can do this. Like for me, I added a bit more peppers because I really quite like peppers myself. But if you're not a fan of peppers, you can add less. And yeah, there's tons of room to make it your own recipe. Please, if you try this recipe, send me some pictures. I would love to see how it turned out, and I would love your feedback on this recipe as well. Thanks for watching, and see you next week.